The grand bazaar of Aurealis Prime was alive with noise, colors, and scents. Traders from a dozen systems shouted their prices. Children darted through the crowd chasing holographic pets, and shimmering banners flapped high above in the dusty breeze. Amid the chaos, an alien heiress walked with quiet poise, her pale blue skin standing out against the dusty stone walls and rust-colored streets. Her crisp white blouse and silver jewelry made her seem untouchable, a star shining in the dirt. But she wasn't here for luxury. She had come to feel the pulse of her people, to remember what it was like beyond the palace gates. Around her neck hung a necklace on a chain of tarnished silver. The amulet wasn't extravagant compared to the sparkling jewels sold all around her, but it was her most precious possession. It had belonged to her mother, passed down through bloodlines heavy with family history. Whenever she touched it, she felt like her mother's voice was still near. It was a shield against loneliness. That day it rested warmly against her skin, as if reminding her she wasn't alone. She moved through the market stalls with grace, but every step drew eyes. Some admired her beauty, others resented her privilege, and a few watched with sharper intent. She didn't notice. The heiress had grown up believing that most people would respect her title even if she was dressed plainly, even if she was alone. She was wrong. The attack came without warning. A large figure burst from a shadowed alley with the speed of a predator. His armor was black, heavy plates etched with marks of a gang crest. His eyes locked not on her face, not on her clothes, but on the amulet at her throat. His hand shot forward with practiced violence, seizing the chain. The silver link snapped with a sickening sound. The thief yanked so hard that the chain tore her blouse open, leaving fabric dangling in tatters. She stumbled backward, gasping, one hand clutching her chest while the other reached desperately toward the necklace already slipping from her. The armored thug sneered, holding the amulet high as though mocking her. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Merchants froze mid-call, their customers retreating in silence. A noble being robbed in broad daylight. It should have been unthinkable. But fear ruled the marketplace. Everyone knew the gangs. Everyone knew their brutality. No one dared interfere, no one wanted to be marked as the next victim. Heads turned away. Feet shuffled back. The heiress was left standing, humiliated and trembling. Her heart pounded painfully. It wasn't the torn blouse that made her cheeks burn, nor the eyes that darted quickly away from her shame. It was the loss of the amulet. Her last tie to her mother was in the hands of a stranger who would sell it, melt it, or worse, simply discard it. Tears stung her eyes, but her body refused to move. She was frozen, prey caught in the open, and then something broke the silence. A crash of glass, the thud of a heavy box hitting the stones. Heads turned again, this time to see a human. Broad-shouldered, sweat-stained, dressed in rough clothes that marked him as a laborer. He had been carrying supplies when the robbery unfolded. For a moment he too had stood in shock, but now his eyes locked on the heiress, on her ripped blouse, and on the amulet dangling in the thief's hands. Something deep inside him ignited. He could have walked away. No one would have judged him for it. Humans weren't expected to get involved in alien disputes. They were workers, second-class citizens on this world. Tolerated but rarely respected. Yet the injustice gnawed at him. He thought of his own mother, long gone, of the little keepsake he still carried in his pocket every day just to feel close to her. And when he saw the heiress's trembling hand reaching for something already lost, he couldn't stay still. The human's boots scraped against stone as he stepped forward, fists tightening. The thug barely glanced at him at first, dismissing him as another piece of market trash. But then the human didn't stop. He crossed the space between them, eyes blazing, chest heaving with determination. He didn't have armor. He didn't have weapons. He didn't even have a plan. All he had was the belief that some things were worth fighting for. The heiress's breath caught as she realized what he was doing. "No!" she tried to shout, but the word came out strangled, lost in the noise of her pounding heart. She didn't know this human. He wasn't her guard, her servant, or her ally, but he was moving faster than she could stop him, fueled by something rawer than fear. The thug sneered when he finally realized the human wasn't going to back down. His armored hand clenched the amulet tighter, the silver digging into his palm. "Walk away, rat," he growled, his voice deep and laced with threat. Around them the crowd leaned back further, forming a widening circle. They didn't want blood on their shoes, but the human didn't walk away. His jaw set, his chest squared, and his voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Give it back." The simplicity of his words made them heavier, a demand that seemed absurd yet rang with a kind of authority no one expected. He wasn't speaking as a worker or a beggar. He was speaking as a man who would not stand by. The heiress's trembling subsided just for a moment. Her wide eyes met his back as he stood between her and the thief. She didn't understand why, but her lungs filled with air again, her chest rising as if his defiance gave her breath. She clutched the tatters of her blouse closer, her fingers shaking, and whispered a prayer to the stars. The thug laughed, sharp and cruel. "You'll die for a piece of metal?" he spat, dangling the amulet as if to taunt him further. The silver caught the sun flashing in the human's eyes. He thought again of his mother, of loss, of dignity stripped away by those stronger than you. And in that moment, death seemed like a price worth paying. His muscles coiled, ready. He knew he couldn't match the thug's armor or weapons, but he also knew something the armored brute didn't. Humans fought differently. They fought with desperation, with stubbornness, with a fury born not from pride but from survival. And when they had nothing left, they fought hardest of all. The bazaar held its breath. Merchants, travelers, even thieves watched to see what would happen next. Many had already written the human off as a fool, another corpse about to stain the market floor. But somewhere deep in the crowd a whisper stirred. A human stood up. The heiress pressed her hand against her chest, over the spot where the amulet had once rested. She couldn't stop staring at the man's back, the way he squared his shoulders as if he could carry the weight of the galaxy itself. For the first time since her mother's death, she felt something stir inside her chest that wasn't grief. It was hope. The thug's sneer faltered as he sensed it too. The crowd wasn't mocking anymore. They were watching, waiting. The human wasn't supposed to matter, yet here he was, shifting the balance of the moment. The thief's grip tightened on the amulet as if afraid it might slip away, but his eyes narrowed. He was ready to crush this defiance in one brutal strike. The human bent his knees, fists clenched. His breath came slow, steady. Fear clawed at his stomach, but he forced it down. This wasn't about him anymore. It wasn't even about the heiress. It was about something bigger, the belief that some things should never be taken, that dignity should never be torn, that memories should never be stolen. He would fight for that, no matter the cost. And as the sun beat down on the Grand Bazaar, as the crowd waited in taut silence, the stage was set. The thief grinned with cruel confidence. The heiress clutched her broken blouse with wide eyes, and the human stepped into the storm with nothing but his fists and his fire. The first move was coming. And once it began, nothing in the bazaar, or perhaps in the galaxy, would be the same again. The thug lunged first, his armored fist swinging with brutal force. The air cracked as it cut through, aiming for the human's jaw with enough power to shatter bone. But the human ducked low, instincts honed from years of hard labor guiding him. The punch whistled past his ear and slammed into a wooden crate behind him, splintering it to pieces. The crowd gasped as debris flew. The human countered immediately, driving his shoulder into the thug's gut with a raw, desperate shove. Armor clanged, and the thug staggered back a step. It wasn't much, but it was enough to break the illusion that this fight was already over. The heiress's eyes widened. He wasn't just standing up, he was holding his ground. Anger twisted across the thug's face. With a snarl, he swung again, this time catching the human's ribs. Pain exploded through his side, but the human didn't fall. He gritted his teeth, feeling the sharp edge of breath knocked from his lungs, yet he stayed upright. The crowd murmured louder now, whispers turning to disbelief. No one should have survived that hit. The human knew he couldn't outlast this fight. Every strike from the thug felt like colliding with metal and stone. His arms ached, his chest burned, and his knuckles split as he hammered uselessly against the armored plates. But he wasn't trying to win a battle of strength. He was trying to show that someone, even a human, wouldn't bow. The thug shoved him back, fury etched into every line of his sneer. "Stay down," he growled, swinging his boot for a crushing kick. The human twisted aside, letting the boot crash into a stone pillar instead. Dust rained down, the marketplace trembling with the impact. Somewhere in the crowd a child cried out. Somewhere else a voice whispered louder, "He's fighting." The heiress clutched the remnants of her blouse tighter, her heart pounding so fast she thought it might break. She wanted to scream for the human to run, to stop before he was killed, but her voice caught in her throat. Watching him defy the thug, even bloodied and battered, planted a strange strength in her veins. For the first time in years, she didn't feel powerless. The thug raised the amulet high again, taunting him. "You're bleeding for trash," he sneered. His voice was sharp, carrying over the murmurs of the crowd. It's worthless to me, but I'll grind it to dust just to make you watch. He moved to crush it in his gauntlet. Rage exploded in the human's chest. He didn't think, he only moved. With a roar, he slammed his fist into the thug's exposed jawline beneath the helmet's edge. The impact rang out like a crack of thunder. The thug stumbled back, more shocked than hurt, but his grip faltered. The amulet slipped, dangling loosely between armored fingers. The crowd gasped as if they all inhaled at once. The human lunged again, ignoring the pain screaming through his ribs. He seized the thug's wrist with both hands, wrenching it back with everything he had. Muscles burned, joints screamed, but for a brief moment the amulet teetered, caught between them. The heiress took a step forward without realizing it, her hands half raised as though she could will it back into her possession. The thug roared in fury, slamming his forehead into the human's. Stars burst across the human's vision, blood streaming from a split brow. He staggered, but his grip didn't loosen. He held on like a drowning man clutching a lifeline, as though letting go would mean surrendering more than just an object. It would mean surrendering what it meant to be human. The marketplace was alive now with voices. Some shouted for the fight to stop, others cried encouragement, and a few cursed the human for bringing chaos. But all of them watched. No one turned away anymore. Even in their fear, they couldn't look elsewhere. Something unseen was shifting in the air, something greater than one necklace or one noblewoman. The thug finally ripped free, tossing the human aside. He crashed into a fruit stall, crates of citrus exploding around him in a spray of pulp and rind. Pain screamed through his body, but he forced himself to rise, clutching a broken piece of wood in his hand. His chest heaved, his vision swam, but still he came forward. The heiress's breath hitched. He looked less like a worker now and more like a warrior dragged from legend. The thug sneered, but there was unease in his eyes. He had beaten countless challengers before, but this one was different. This one didn't break. Why? He spat, glaring at the human through the slit of his helm. Why risk your life for her? She isn't even your kind. The human spat blood onto the stones, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and met the thug's gaze with fire, because no one else will. His voice cracked, raw and hoarse, but the words carried. They echoed in the bazaar, in the hearts of those who listened, and they struck the heiress like a blade through her chest. The thug's fury boiled over. He charged, bringing his armored fist down like a hammer meant to end it once and for all, but the human stepped sideways at the last instant, driving the shard of wood into the joint of the thug's armor. The cry of pain that followed silenced the marketplace. It wasn't victory, but it was blood. The thug staggered, his grip on the amulet weakening. The human snatched at it, fingers brushing the silver. For a heartbeat, it dangled between them once more. Time seemed to freeze. The heiress holding her breath, the crowd leaning forward, the thug's rage and the human's desperation colliding in a single fragile chain. And then the amulet snapped free. The human stumbled back, clutching it in his hand, blood dripping over the silver as though consecrating it with his own sacrifice. A cheer erupted from somewhere deep in the crowd, raw and unplanned, and it spread like fire. Voices rose together, a roar of astonishment and defiance. The thug bellowed in rage, his weapon rising for a killing blow. The human had no time to move, no strength left to dodge. He braced himself, clutching the amulet against his chest as though daring death to come. But before the strike could land, something else happened. The heiress moved. Her hand shot forward, catching the thug's arm with a speed and ferocity no one expected. Power shimmered faintly in her veins, an echo of bloodlines long forgotten in politics and privilege. She shoved, and for the first time the thug stumbled from her strength rather than the human's. Gasps echoed again. She was not helpless. The thug's fury turned to shock, then to calculation. This was no longer a simple robbery. The crowd was no longer silent witnesses. The human was no longer just a target. The heiress was no longer prey. Something had been broken here, something that could not be repaired with threats. His grip tightened on his weapon, but his eyes darted nervously at the swelling crowd. The human struggled to stand, blood dripping from his mouth, the amulet still clutched tightly in his hand. He looked at the heiress, their eyes locking for the first time. For a moment, everything else faded. The dust, the noise, the looming danger. In her gaze, he saw gratitude, strength, and something unspoken. In his, she saw pain, defiance, and a fire she had never known. And as the thug raised his weapon again, the marketplace reached a boiling point. The crowd was no longer just watching. They were choosing. Some began to step forward, slow and uncertain, but no longer hiding behind fear. The humans' defiance had sparked something in them, and the heiress's stand fanned it brighter. The thug snarled, realizing he was losing control of the moment. This wasn't about an amulet anymore. It was about power, about fear, about whether one man and one woman could shatter the silence of 100 others. His eyes darted, his chest heaved, and for the first time he hesitated. The heiress reached for the human's arm, steadying him even as her own hands trembled. Her torn blouse flapped lightly in the breeze, but she didn't hide it anymore. She stood taller, her voice rising clear and strong. "You will not take this from me," she declared, her words carrying over the crowd. "Not my mother's memory, not my dignity, not my people's courage." The crowd erupted again, louder this time, voices uniting into something unstoppable. The thug's face twisted as he realized the tide had turned, but his pride wouldn't let him retreat. Not yet. He bared his teeth, weapon shaking in his hand, caught between rage and the dawning fear of a revolution brewing before his eyes. The human wiped blood from his chin, the amulet gleaming in his hand. He met the thug's glare with steel in his eyes and whispered words the heiress alone could hear. "We stand together now." The thug's breathing grew heavy, each inhale rattling behind his helmet. His pride demanded blood, but the crowd's shifting energy pressed on him like an invisible weight. For the first time in years, he wasn't feared. He was challenged, not only by a human, but by the silent awakening of dozens who had once kept their heads low. It was a nightmare he had never imagined. The human swayed on his feet, blood dripping steadily down his temple, ribs aching with every breath. He felt the weight of exhaustion pulling at his muscles. But when he saw the heiress standing beside him, shoulders squared, he forced his body upright once more. He couldn't let her stand alone, not now. The heiress placed a hand over her mother's amulet in his grasp, their fingers brushing together. The silver burned cold from the blood smeared across it, yet she felt warmth surge through her chest. It wasn't just the heirloom she was reclaiming. It was a piece of herself, a voice she had thought silenced long ago. The crowd murmured louder, pressing in around the circle of broken crates and shattered stalls. Some eyes shone with awe, others with hope, and a few with the kind of fierce courage born only when chains start to crack. The thug looked around, realizing he wasn't surrounded by frightened sheep anymore. He was surrounded by wolves sharpening their teeth. He snarled, lifting his weapon high, the blade catching the afternoon light. "You think one human changes anything?" His voice boomed, trembling with rage. "You think defiance makes you free? I'll crush him, and you'll all remember your place." The words echoed, but they lacked the certainty they once carried. The human coughed, spitting red onto the stones, then lifted his chin. "Maybe you'll crush me," he rasped, his voice raw yet unyielding. "But you won't silence us." His eyes burned as he glanced at the crowd, daring them to hear what he was saying, daring them to believe. A ripple spread through the people like a stone cast into still water. Some shouted words of encouragement, timid at first, then louder. Others stamped their feet or raised fists. The energy thickened, alive and volatile, pressing tighter around the thug. His hand shook as he tightened his grip on the weapon, fury clashing with a gnawing doubt. The heiress stepped forward, her torn blouse fluttering against her skin. She raised her chin, her voice cutting clear through the noise. "This amulet was my mother's, a symbol of who we are. You tried to take it, to strip away what makes us strong, but you can't. Not anymore." Her words ignited the crowd further, drawing roars of agreement. The thug lunged, desperate to reclaim control through violence. His blade slashed through the air, aimed at the human's chest. The heiress cried out, but the human twisted aside at the last moment, the edge grazing his shoulder and tearing flesh. Pain seared through him, but he didn't falter. He drove his fist upward, striking the thug's jaw again with a resounding crack. The thug stumbled, teeth rattling, rage consuming his features. He swung again wildly, but the human caught his wrist, straining with every ounce of strength left in him. The marketplace thundered with the roar of voices, no longer spectators but witnesses to something transformative. The people wanted him to stand, needed him to stand. Blood streaked the human's face, blurring his vision. Still, he held the thug's wrist, refusing to let go. His body screamed for rest, but his spirit refused. He wasn't fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for her, for the crowd, for the idea that even a human's defiance could crack the unbreakable. The thug tried to push forward, but the noise of the crowd grew deafening. Their chants grew rhythm, words forming from the chaos. Stand, stand, stand. The voices shook the stones, rattled the walls, and for the first time, the thug looked unsettled, fear flickering in his eyes. The heiress stepped to the human side, pressing her palm against his back to steady him. Her touch was both anchor and fuel. He gritted his teeth, shoving with renewed strength, forcing the thug backward one step, then another. Each step stolen from the thug's dominance rang like a victory drum to the crowd. The thug roared, slamming his knee into the human's gut, trying to break him. The human doubled over but refused to collapse. He rose again, coughing blood, staring the thug down with eyes that burned like fire. The crowd erupted louder at the sight. His defiance was no longer just survival. It was defiance for all of them. The heiress lifted the amulet high above her head, its silver gleaming through the dust and chaos. "This will never belong to you," she shouted, her voice strong enough to rival the thug's roars. "It belongs to us, to our future, and you cannot steal that." The crowd thundered in response, voices crashing like waves against stone. The thug faltered, rage turning to frustration. His power had always rested in fear and silence, in the belief that no one would rise against him. But fear was slipping through his fingers, replaced with fire that spread from one human and one heiress to hundreds. He raised his blade again, but his hand shook now. The human staggered, leaning on the broken piece of wood he still clutched. He pointed it toward the thug like a weapon, voice hoarse but defiant. "You don't scare us anymore." The words landed harder than any blow, striking deeper than fists or blades. They were no longer alone in their defiance. The marketplace pulsed with energy. The chants grew louder, unifying, a storm of voices rising higher and higher. People surged forward, no longer hiding behind stalls. Some grabbed stones, others lifted tools, all of them standing taller than they had before. The thug turned, realization dawning that he wasn't facing one or two anymore. He was facing hundreds. The heiress's heart pounded, not just with fear, but with exhilaration. She had never felt so alive, so unshackled from the chains of expectation. She looked at the human, battered and broken yet unyielding, and she realized he had given them something no wealth or title could ever buy: courage. The thug swung once more, desperation guiding his strike. The human caught it on the shard of wood, the splintered edge biting into the weapon's metal with a shriek. Sparks flew and the two locked eyes locked wills. Neither moved for a long, breathless moment, their struggle suspended in time. Then the human shoved with the last of his strength. The thug stumbled backward, crashing into a toppled stall. Dust billowed, and the crowd roared so loudly it drowned out every other sound. For the first time, the thug looked small, diminished by the will of those he once ruled by fear. The human collapsed to his knees, chest heaving, blood streaming from his wounds. But his grip on the amulet never loosened. The heiress knelt beside him, wrapping her arm around his shoulders, holding him upright as the crowd surged closer. She looked into his eyes and whispered, "You've changed everything." The thug rose again, weapon trembling in his grasp, but the crowd no longer parted for him. Dozens stepped forward, their faces hard, their voices sharp. He saw it then. The end of his reign wasn't coming from blades or blows. It was coming from their defiance, born from one human stand, and for the first time the thug hesitated, unsure if he could take another step forward. The thug stood at the edge of the circle, his weapon trembling as he glared at the sea of faces closing in around him. His chest heaved, sweat dripping beneath his armor, rage mixing with disbelief. He had ruled with fear for years, but now fear had turned its back on him. What stared back was something he couldn't control. The human struggled to rise, his legs shaking under him. Blood ran freely down his arm and temple, but he refused to remain on his knees. With the heiress steadying him, he forced himself upright, swaying like a man on the brink of collapse. The crowd fell silent for a moment, every eye fixed on him. He lifted the amulet high, silver gleaming beneath the dust and fading light. His voice cracked, but it carried across the square. "This doesn't belong to him. It belongs to her, to all of you, to anyone who refuses to bow." His words were not a shout. They were a promise, and they landed heavier than a roar. The thug snarled, desperate to reclaim the fear slipping from his grasp. "You think this changes anything? You think you've won?" He raised his weapon with a shaky hand, pointing it toward the human. "One strike and this ends." But his voice lacked conviction, and the crowd heard it. The heiress stepped forward, still holding the human steady. Her torn blouse clung to her shoulders, but she no longer cared. She lifted her chin, fire in her eyes. "No," she said, voice sharp and unyielding. "It ends with you." The crowd erupted, voices thundering their agreement. Dozens moved as one, stepping between the thug and his prey. Men and women who had cowered for years now stood shoulder to shoulder, blocking his path. They weren't warriors, but they were more dangerous than soldiers because they were no longer afraid. The thug's weapon lowered, doubt slicing through his fury. He bellowed in desperation, charging toward the crowd. But the people surged forward, hands grabbing, pulling, striking. Tools and stones battered against his armor. He swung wildly, but for every step he gained, 10 pushed him back. His roars turned to panicked shouts drowned by the sound of defiance. The human staggered, clutching his ribs, watching as the crowd overwhelmed the thug. He had no strength left to join them, but he didn't need to. This was no longer his fight alone. He had lit the spark, and now the fire burned without him. His chest swelled with pride even through the pain. The Heiress held him close, shielding him as the chaos raged. She could hardly believe what she was seeing. The people who had always bowed now rose, voices uniting like a single heartbeat. Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't of sorrow. They were of rebirth. This was what her mother had dreamed of. The thug fell to his knees, armor dented and cracked under the relentless blows. His weapon slipped from his hand, clattering across the stones. The crowd closed in tighter, their chants echoing like thunder. His eyes darted wildly, searching for an escape that no longer existed. Finally, with a broken snarl, he collapsed face first into the dust. The people roared, their voices shaking the ground. The weapon was seized, the armor stripped, and the thug was dragged into the shadows of the marketplace. His reign had ended, not with a duel, but with a people reclaiming themselves. The crowd turned back toward the human and the Heiress. He swayed, barely able to stand, his face pale from blood loss. Yet when he raised the amulet one last time, the marketplace shook with cheers louder than any the city had known. For them, he was no longer just a human. He was proof that anyone could rise. The Heiress took the amulet gently from his hand, cradling it against her heart. She leaned close, her voice trembling with emotion. "You've given us back more than a necklace. You've given us our courage." The human managed a weak smile, eyes heavy with exhaustion, but the pride in his gaze was unshakable. She helped him down onto the steps of a ruined stall, lowering him carefully so he could rest. Around them the people gathered, no longer strangers but bound together by what they had witnessed. Some bowed their heads in respect. Others reached out, touching the human's shoulder, whispering thanks. The human struggled to speak, his breath shallow. "It wasn't just me," he said hoarsely. "You stood too. You all did." His words were faint but struck deep, reminding them that the victory belonged not to one, but to all who chose to stand. The chants grew again, not of his name, but of unity. The Heiress pressed her forehead gently against his, whispering words only he could hear. "You're not alone anymore." It wasn't a promise of riches or titles, but it was something far greater. Acceptance, belonging, and a bond forged in fire. The human's tired smile widened just enough to show he understood. The night fell slowly, stars glittering above the marketplace that had once been a prison of silence. Now it buzzed with life, energy, and hope. Lanterns were lit, food shared, and stories began to spread. The tale of one human who stood against fear was already being told, carried from voice to voice like sparks on the wind. The thug was gone, but his shadow lingered. Yet that shadow no longer held power. The people had seen what could be done when one stood against many, when courage broke chains. They would not bow so easily again. The human had left a mark that would not fade. The Heiress sat beside him, watching the people reclaim their square, her mother's amulet gleaming in her hands. She knew this was only the beginning. There would be more battles, more threats, but now they had a foundation. Now they had proof that even the smallest could spark a revolution. The human closed his eyes, his body finally giving in to exhaustion. He didn't fear drifting into unconsciousness, not anymore. He was safe here, among the people he had defended, safe with her, and for the first time in years he felt he truly belonged. The Heiress brushed his bloodied hair back, whispering softly, "Rest, hero. Tomorrow we build something new." Her voice carried hope not just for him but for everyone who listened. The crowd quieted, hearing her words as if they were a vow. In the days to come, songs would be sung of the human who bled for an Heiress, of the moment when fear was broken by defiance. His name would become a rallying cry. His story a spark carried across the stars. But in this moment, beneath the lantern light and the starlit sky, he was simply a man who refused to bow. And because of that, an entire people rose with him.